What happens when hundreds of men are sent into battle, only to be forgotten by the very nation they swore to protect? It was October 1918, the final, blood-soaked autumn of the First World War. The Argonne Forest, a place of fog and death, stretched like a living nightmare across the French countryside. Trees were splintered by shells, the air hung thick with the metallic scent of blood, and somewhere deep inside that green hell, nearly 600 American soldiers vanished without a trace. They were known as the Lost Battalion. But before they disappeared, before their cries for help went unanswered, they were just ordinary men, factory workers, farmers, immigrants, thrust into a war that no one truly understood. Their orders were simple: push forward, break the German lines, and end the war once and for all. But what began as a mission of triumph turned into one of the most haunting chapters in American history. The men moved under a canopy of dripping leaves, their boots sinking into mud that smelled of rot and decay. Rain fell in thin sheets, washing over their rifles and soaking their uniforms until they clung to their skin. Captain George McMurtry squinted through the gloom, scanning the trees for movement. Ahead of him, Major Charles Whittlesey, a tall, stoic lawyer from New York, studied his map by the dim light of a trembling lantern. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "We advance at dawn." What he didn't know was that the lines of communication behind him were breaking apart. Orders were getting lost. Messages were delayed. And somewhere along the chain, the rest of the army had stopped moving. The Lost Battalion didn't realize it yet, but they were walking straight into the jaws of isolation, deep behind enemy lines, with no support, no escape, and no one coming to help. At first, everything seemed to go as planned. The battalion surged forward through the trees, driving the Germans from their trenches. The men cheered. Victory felt close enough to taste. But by nightfall, something felt wrong. The gunfire behind them had gone silent. No reinforcements. No backup. Just the eerie rustle of the forest and the distant echo of artillery fire. Whittlesey ordered a halt. "Hold your positions," he said. "We'll get word soon." But no word came. By the second day, they realized the truth. They were completely surrounded. The Germans had closed in from every side, cutting them off from the rest of the Allied advance. Supplies were dwindling. Ammunition was running low. And still, they held their ground. In the chaos of the Argonne, even the air felt alive, filled with the whine of bullets and the screams of the wounded. Men huddled in muddy foxholes, clutching letters from home, praying they'd live long enough to send a reply. Others lay still, faces pale beneath their helmets, staring at the canopy above as if it might open up to heaven. By the third day, thirst had become their enemy. The only water came from puddles tainted with blood and decay. Hungry, delirious, and running out of hope, the men turned to Whittlesey for direction. He said little, but his eyes told them what they needed to know. Hold fast. Do not surrender. It wasn't just stubbornness. It was belief. Belief in their mission, belief in one another, and belief that someone out there still knew they existed. Meanwhile, miles away, the rest of the American forces had no idea what had happened to them. Commanders assumed Whittlesey's men were advancing as planned. Maps showed their position as secure. And so, the Lost Battalion, trapped in a pocket of death, continued to fight, unseen and unheard. The Germans, realizing they were dealing with an isolated force, began their psychological warfare. Leaflets fluttered down from the trees, promising mercy if the Americans laid down their arms. "You are surrounded!" One note read, "You have no chance." Whittlesey read it, crumpled it in his fist, and said quietly, "Tell them to go to hell." Every man who heard him found new strength in those words. They fought with renewed fury, not for glory, but for survival. Machine guns rattled day and night. Mortar shells tore through the forests, splintering trees and bodies alike. The wounded were carried to a shallow ravine, where medics worked by the dim light of the moon, wrapping bandages with trembling hands. The forest stank of gunpowder, blood, and rain. When food ran out, the men ate whatever they could find. Scraps, bark, even grass. They rationed their remaining ammunition like gold. And still, they refused to surrender. It was then that one of the most extraordinary acts of courage in military history took place. one that would forever change how wars were fought. Pinned down and desperate for help, Whittlesey decided to send a message back to headquarters. Radio was useless. Runners were being cut down before they could make it through. So they turned to the only messenger left alive, a pigeon named Cher Ami. They tied a note to her leg, a simple plea scratched in pencil. "We are along the road parallel 276.4. Our artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." The pigeon took flight into the rain, her wings beating furiously as shells exploded all around. The men watched her disappear into the storm, their last hope vanishing into smoke. Minutes passed, then hours. No one knew if she'd made it. Then, far away, a battered, blood-covered pigeon fell into a communication trench behind the Allied lines. One eye gone, her leg barely attached, but the message was still there. The coordinates were correct. The friendly artillery stopped firing. For the first time in days, there was silence. The Lost Battalion had survived their own army's bombardment, but they were far from saved. The Germans launched new attacks, determined to crush what remained of the Americans. Yet, no matter how many shells they fired, the men held firm. They fought off wave after wave, sometimes with bayonets, sometimes with stones and fists. Every hour became a test of endurance. And then, almost miraculously, on October 7th, 1918, after 6 days of hell, rescue finally came. When Allied forces reached the ravine, they found a scene out of nightmares. Out of the 554 men who had entered the forest, only 194 walked out alive. The rest were dead, missing, or too wounded to move. Whittlesey refused to leave until every surviving man had been carried out. When he finally emerged from the forest, reporters asked him what had kept him going. He said nothing, just stared into the distance, his eyes hollow. They called them heroes. Medals were pinned to their chests. Streets and schools would one day bear their names. But the truth was far more complicated. Whittlesey himself, the man who had refused to surrender, was haunted by what he'd seen. The cheers and parades couldn't erase the screams that still echoed in his mind. Years later, unable to bear the weight of his memories, he boarded a ship bound for Havana and walked off its deck into the sea. His body was never recovered. Yet even in death, his story and the story of his men refused to sink. Because the Lost Battalion did more than survive. They changed how the world understood courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. Their ordeal exposed the flaws in military communication, leading to reforms that saved countless lives in future wars. Their resilience inspired a generation of soldiers to believe that even in isolation, their fight mattered. And in a strange, almost poetic way, their disappearance into the fog of war revealed something enduring about the American spirit, the will to stand firm, even when the world goes silent around you. But there's something else. Something few people know. In the chaos of their rescue, an intelligence officer reportedly found a map among the German documents. A map that hinted the enemy had known their exact position days before the encirclement even began. Which raises a question no one ever truly answered. Were they lost by accident? Or sacrificed on purpose? The answer lies buried somewhere in the Argonne, beneath the trees, beneath the mud, and beneath the silence of history itself. And in the next part of this story, we'll go back into that forest to uncover what really happened to the Lost Battalion and why their story was almost erased from the pages of time. The rain had stopped, but the forest still whispered with ghosts. In the pale light of dawn, the ground of the Argonne looked less like a battlefield and more like a graveyard the earth itself had tried to forget. Torn helmets half buried in the mud, rifles leaning against trees as if waiting for men who would never return. Smoke hung low, unmoving, trapped between the trunks like a memory, unwilling to fade. In that silence, rescuers moved carefully, stepping over shell holes filled with brown water. They called out names, but their voices only echoed back. Every few feet, another motionless body, some still clutching their weapons, others lying face down, their dog tags glinting faintly in the light. Among the living, the survivors barely spoke. Their faces were gaunt, their uniforms they looked more like shadows than soldiers. When Major Whittlesey was found, He didn't speak at first. He simply stared at the ground, listening to the quiet as if it were louder than any shell fire he'd ever heard. When the rescuers told him they were safe, he gave a small nod. Not in relief, but in disbelief. Safe. The word didn't seem to belong to the forest anymore. In the days that followed, as they were carried out of the Argonne, rumors began to spread, whispers that the Lost Battalion hadn't been lost at all. That someone, somewhere, had known exactly where they were. And that someone had chosen not to send help. At first, no one wanted to believe it. It was easier to call it chaos, to blame the fog of war, the confusion of battle. But the documents recovered from the German positions told another story, one that suggested a chilling possibility. Among the captured papers was a crude map, marked with small black X's, each representing an American unit. And one of those X's sat precisely where Whittlesey's men had been trapped. Dated 3 days before the rescue. How could the Germans have known their position with such precision? Historians later speculated about a miscommunication, a reconnaissance leak, maybe even intercepted radio signals. But the simplest explanation, and perhaps the most terrifying, was that the battalion had been sent too far. Too fast, pushed into enemy territory as part of a desperate gamble to break the German line before winter. A gamble made by commanders sitting miles away from the front, far from the mud and the screams. The Lost Battalion had been the tip of the spear, but when the shaft behind it broke, the spearhead was left buried in the wound. Whittlesey never publicly accused anyone. In his silence, people heard either dignity or resignation. But in his personal letters, those never meant for the newspapers, a different tone emerged. He wrote of guilt, of faces that wouldn't leave him, of the question that haunted him every night. Had their sacrifice really mattered? Meanwhile, across the ocean, back in America, their story was already being reshaped into legend. Newspapers printed dramatic illustrations, soldiers standing firm under fire. Banners reading Heroes of the Argonne. The press loved it. Men abandoned, surrounded, and yet unbroken. It was the perfect symbol of American courage. But the men themselves knew a different truth. They weren't gods of war. They were tired, frightened, starving men who had simply refused to die. When they returned home, parades awaited them. Crowds cheered as the survivors marched through city streets, though most could barely stand. Mothers wept. Bands played patriotic tunes. And behind the applause, some of the men flinched at the sound of drums that reminded them of artillery. For Whittlesey, the celebrations felt hollow. Every handshake was a reminder of the hands he couldn't save. Every medal pinned to his chest felt heavier than the last. In his eyes, heroism was not in victory. It was in endurance, in holding on when the world forgot you existed. Yet even as he struggled to find peace, the story of the Lost Battalion began to shape something larger than itself. Military leaders studied their ordeal, revising tactics, improving communication lines, changing how orders were relayed in combat. The lesson of those men, that courage alone could not compensate for broken systems, became the foundation for future reforms. But history, as it often does, began to blur the line between myth and truth. The public wanted heroes, not tragedies. And so, over time, the story was polished. The fear, the doubt, the unanswered questions all sanded away until what remained was a clean narrative of bravery and triumph. Still, some couldn't let go of the shadows that lingered behind the legend. One of them was Lieutenant Arthur McKeo, a survivor who'd kept a small notebook throughout the ordeal. Decades later, when his grandson found it in a box of old war relics, he discovered entries that contradicted much of what had been told. McKeo wrote of orders that never made sense, of maps that showed false front lines, of signals ignored. He wrote of a runner who swore he'd reached headquarters with a message from Whittlesey days before the rescue, only to be told to hold position until further notice. If true, it meant someone knew. And they left them there anyway. Why? The question lingers even now. Perhaps it was simple negligence, a chain of command too tangled to respond in time. Or perhaps, as some later theorized, it was politics. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was the largest operation in U.S. military history at the time. Commanders needed results, progress on the map, not men on the ground. The Lost Battalion's advance, though reckless, gave the illusion of momentum. And in war, illusions can be worth more than lives. The truth was likely buried with the men who made those decisions. Years after the war, the forest reclaimed the battlefield. Grass grew over the trenches. The wind erased the sounds of gunfire. Only a small stone monument now stands where the battalion made its stand. Eishinpuru inscription. Here stood the 77th Division, 308th Infantry. October 2nd to 7th, 1918 visitors still come, sometimes leaving tokens, a small flag, a photograph, a letter. Among the trees, the silence feels almost sacred. Yet, if you listen closely, it isn't the silence of peace. It's the silence of memory. One French villager who lived near the site would later tell a historian that, even decades after the war, she could still hear faint echoes on quiet nights, the distant rhythm of boots. A whistle cutting through the dark, the murmur of voices carried by the wind. They never left, she said softly. Not all of them, but perhaps what truly kept the Lost Battalion alive wasn't the sound of their ghosts, but the ripple of what they left behind. Their defiance inspired countless soldiers in later wars. Their suffering sparked changes that would save thousands of lives in battles yet to come. And their endurance became a quiet lesson etched into the soul of a generation that real heroism isn't born in the roar of victory, but in the silence between despair and hope. Still, the mystery of their abandonment continued to haunt military historians for decades. Files remained sealed, reports missing. Some letters were redacted, names blacked out. Even now, some suspect there was more to their loss than the chaos of war. In 1931, when Whittlesey took his final voyage and never returned, newspapers framed it as the tragic end of a weary hero. But those who had known him closely believed his disappearance wasn't an escape from life. It was a return to his men. They said he'd been seen the night before, sitting on the deck, gazing out over the black water, whispering something to himself. No one could make out the words. One sailor claimed he heard just a single phrase, "They're still waiting." 4 years after, others from the battalion passed away quietly, some in hospitals, some in small towns, others forgotten entirely. But the legend refused to die. Books, films, even songs carry their story into new generations. Yet for every retelling, something essential was lost. The question that had begun it all, were they abandoned by accident or by design? Recently, declassified records shed new light. Some dispatch logs from the Meuse-Argonne sector, long thought destroyed, revealed inconsistencies, orders time-stamped after they were supposedly sent, coordinates that changed mysteriously overnight. The picture that emerges isn't one of conspiracy so much as of tragic indifference. In the machinery of war, human lives had become units of measurement. To the generals, they were a number. To history, they became a symbol. But to each other, in that forest of mud and fear, they were brothers. One surviving letter from Private Abram Krodashen, who escaped the encirclement to guide rescuers back to the trapped men, said it best. We were not lost. We were right where we were told to be. It's the world that lost us. And perhaps that's the real story. Not of men forgotten, but of a world too vast and chaotic to remember them in time. Yet memory has a strange way of circling back. A century later, in 2018, as part of the World War I centennial, a ceremony was held at the site of their stand. Flags from two nations rippled in the wind. A handful of descendants gathered, reading names carved into marble. Among them was a young girl holding a folded note. When asked what it said, she smiled faintly and whispered, "A message for them." Then, she walked to the monument and placed the note in the grass. No one knows what was written inside. But as the sun dipped behind the trees, for just a moment, the lights seemed to catch the mist in a way that made the forest shimmer, as if acknowledging her offering. Some said it was just the wind, others, that it was the forest remembering. But for those who stood there that day, the feeling was unmistakable, that something unfinished still lingered, waiting to be uncovered. Because somewhere beneath that soil, beneath the quiet roots and the centuries of forgetting, lies the one truth no historian has yet proven. A coded field report, long missing, that could reveal who gave the final order, the one that sent the Lost Battalion forward into the fog. And if that report is ever found, it may rewrite not just their story, but the legacy of how America remembers its heroes. The forest, they say, keeps secrets. And deep within the Argonne, the ground still holds one, waiting for someone brave enough to dig it up. The forest was quiet again. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels unnatural, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The memorial site in the Argonne had long since emptied. The flags had been folded, the crowd dispersed, and the soft echo of footsteps had faded into the trees. But that young girl's note still lay beneath the monument, trembling slightly in the wind. By nightfall, it was gone. No one saw who took it. Days later, a local caretaker found the monument disturbed, a small patch of soil at its base, freshly turned, as though someone had been digging. Beneath it, the man uncovered something strange, a rusted metal canister, sealed shut with wax, its surface etched with numbers and letters faded by time. The inscription read only, "Property of the 77th Division, 1918. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a piece of paper, brittle, water-stained, but still legible. It wasn't a field report or a diary entry. It was a map, but not a map of the battlefield. This one showed supply routes, command posts, and signal lines, and among them, a series of red marks that didn't correspond to any known American or German position. The routes seemed to lead nowhere. Lines crossed out, then redrawn. At the bottom of the map, scrawled in hurried handwriting, were 3 words: "Don't trust division." The discovery might have been dismissed as a hoax, a relic misinterpreted. If not for the signature beneath it, see, the caretaker turned it over to local authorities, and soon, historians were called in. The document was old, authentic, and dated within the week of the Lost Battalion's entrapment. Its message, though brief, was unsettling. If Whittlesey had written it, what did he mean? Don't trust who? In official accounts, Whittlesey was a model officer, disciplined, obedient, loyal to command. But this note hinted at doubt, maybe even betrayal. Could it be that he'd known something wasn't right long before the As word of the find spread, so did speculation. Military experts argued over its meaning, while descendants of the battalion's men began asking questions their families had buried for generations. One of them, a historian named Thomas Raines, decided to investigate. His great-grandfather had fought and died under Whittlesey's command. For Raines, the story wasn't just history. It was blood. He began with the archives, combing through dispatch logs, coded radio transcripts, and battlefield diaries. What he found was a trail of inconsistencies. Small, almost invisible on their own, but when strung together, they painted a pattern that couldn't be ignored. Messages, marked as delivered, had never been received. Coordinates written in pencil didn't match the typed reports. And there were gaps, full hours missing from communication logs. On the very days the battalion went silent, it was as if someone had gone back and edited the past. Raines dug deeper. The U.S. Army Archives yielded a classified file on the 77th Division's operations during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The document was partially redacted, but one section remained intact, a directive titled Operational Containment. It described an order authorizing limited forward movement to maintain enemy focus and protect flanking units. The directive was signed by a general whose name Raines recognized instantly, General Alexander, commander of the division. The phrasing was clinical, detached, limited forward movement, but the meaning was clear. The Lost Battalion hadn't been advancing alone by mistake. They'd been sent deliberately to hold enemy attention. A diversion. A sacrifice. Raines sat alone in the dim light of the archive room, the hum of the overhead lights echoing faintly. He read the passage again, his heart pounding. For more than a century, the Lost Battalion had been remembered as heroes who stood their ground against impossible odds. But what if they'd been placed there to die knowingly, strategically, to serve a purpose no one would ever tell them? He closed the file, but the question refused to leave him. Outside, the world went on. Cars moved down wet streets. The wind carried the sound of distant bells. But for Raines, everything felt frozen. Because if what he had found was true, It meant the story that shaped American identity, the myth of courage and perseverance against abandonment, was built not on accident, but on betrayal. As he prepared to leave, the archivist, an elderly man with a tired smile, handed him something unexpected. This was tucked in one of the folders, he said softly. Maybe you should take a look. It was a photograph, old, sepia-toned, edges burned by time. It showed a group of officers standing around a table. Whittlesey was there, unmistakably, his expression unreadable. Beside him stood General Alexander and two other men in uniform. On the back, written faintly in ink, were the words, "Before the push, Argonne, 1918. Something about it felt wrong." Whittlesey's body language rigid, tense, as if caught between duty and doubt. His hand rested on a map that looked eerily similar to the one found beneath the monument. Rains couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking at a moment of decision, the last time Whittlesey might have had a choice. He decided to visit the Argonne himself. The next month, he arrived in France, carrying the photo, the copy of the directive, and the recovered map. The forest was colder than he'd expected, its air damp and heavy with the scent of pine and soil. Standing among the trees, he tried to imagine the chaos that had once filled this place, the thunder of shells, the cries of the wounded, the sound of Whittlesey shouting orders into the void. At the monument, he laid the photograph against the stone and stepped back. The silence pressed in. Only the wind answered. Then he noticed something, a faint metallic glint near the roots of a nearby oak. He brushed away the leaves and uncovered a small brass tag, half buried in the mud. It bore a number and a name, PVTL Rosen, Coquet, 3/8th Infantry, one of the Lost Battalion. He held it in his palm, feeling the cold metal against his skin. The earth had kept it hidden for more than a century, yet here it was, as if the forest itself was offering him a clue. Later, in a local cafe, Rains asked an old man who had lived his whole life near the Argonne about the war. The man nodded slowly. "My grandfather told me stories," he said. "He worked for the French telegraph lines during the offensive," he said. "There were strange orders." American lines suddenly went silent. Messages jammed. Some people thought the interference was German. Others thought it wasn't. Rains leaned forward. "Not German?" The old man hesitated. He said it sounded like someone blocking transmissions from the inside. The revelation hit like a tremor. If true, it meant the Lost Battalion's isolation wasn't just a tragic coincidence, it was engineered. The silence wasn't the fog of war, it was deliberate. That night, Rains returned to his hotel, unable to sleep. He laid the map and the photograph side by side. The red marks on the map, those strange out-of-place symbols, began to look less random the longer he studied them. Connecting them in sequence formed a pattern, a straight line through the forest, ending precisely where the battalion had been trapped. Someone had drawn a path designed to lead them there. And then he saw it faint, nearly invisible under the red markings. A signature, partly smudged, but just legible enough Maj. Hualby Clark! Clark had been the division's intelligence officer, the man responsible for relaying coordinates and verifying enemy positions. If he'd altered the maps even slightly, he could have redirected Whittlesey's advance without anyone realizing. Rains felt the air thicken around him. His pulse quickened. The myth was unraveling before his eyes. But why? What reason could anyone have to send hundreds of men to their deaths, men fighting on the same side? In his notes, Clark had once written about the necessity of controlled loss, the idea that small, sacrificial operations could deceive the enemy into exposing their strength. Could it be that the Lost Battalion had been used as bait? The realization was almost unbearable. Rains stared at the photograph again, his eyes drawn to Whittlesey's expression, that mix of defiance and despair. Maybe Whittlesey had discovered the truth while still in the forest. Maybe that was what Dontro's division meant. And maybe that was the weight he carried until the day he walked into the ocean. By morning, Rains knew what he had to do. He needed proof. Undeniable, irrefutable proof. Something that could confirm Clark's hand in the operation. He returned to the Argonne one last time. The dawn mist was heavy, curling around the trees like smoke. He followed the line drawn on the map deeper into the forest to a small ridge overlooking a ravine. There, hidden beneath moss and roots. He found the remnants of what looked like an old bunker. Its entrance collapsed, but still faintly visible. As he crouched beside it, brushing away debris, his fingers touched metal, a rusted box wedged in the soil. Inside, among scraps of paper and broken instruments, was a single, sealed envelope, its wax still intact, bearing a faded military insignia. He held it carefully, his breath caught in his throat. Across the front, in elegant handwriting, were the words, "To be opened only if the truth is forgotten." And beneath it, a signature, Major R.B. Clark. For a long time, Rains didn't move. The forest was utterly still, as if waiting. The envelope felt impossibly heavy, a century of silence pressed between its folds. When he finally opened it, the paper inside was yellowed, the ink blurred, but one line remained perfectly clear. Operation Diversion. Whittlesey's unit to advance independently. Full knowledge withheld to maintain morale. He read it twice, then 3 times, as the meaning sank in. The Lost Battalion had never been lost. They had been sent forward, knowingly abandoned, to create the illusion of progress. Their courage had been real, but their sacrifice had been orchestrated. And now, 100 years later, the truth had finally clawed its way out of the dirt. Rains stood in the silence, the weight of the revelation pressing against him. The trees around him seemed to lean closer, as if listening. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called, sharp, sudden, echoing through the mist. For the first time, the story of the Lost Battalion wasn't about men forgotten. It was about men remembered for all the wrong reasons. And as the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain and iron, Rains realized something chilling. The truth had survived, but so had the lie. Because even now, in the highest corners of military archives, the official record still called them lost. And someone, somewhere, had made sure it stayed that way. Rain had started to fall over the ravaged forest, not a cleansing rain, but a weary drizzle that made the mud thicker and the air heavier. Each drop carried the smell of iron, smoke, and decay. The men were ghosts, now unshaven, hollow-eyed, and haftily. Their uniforms were shredded, their boots sinking into a landscape that looked more like the surface of another world than France. Somewhere in that gray silence, a single thought bound them together. They were not supposed to be alive anymore. And yet, they still were. Captain Whittlesey stood beneath a splintered tree, staring at the tattered map in his hands, though he already knew it was useless. The rain had turned the paper soft, erasing the ink lines that once promised direction. He folded it anyway, carefully, as though respect for something lost still mattered. Around him, men crouched in the muck, staring into nothing, some whispering prayers, others humming tunes under their breath, as if afraid to forget the sound of music. Then came the sound, distant at first, a low rumble, like the earth groaning in its sleep. The men tensed. Artillery again, or rescue? No one dared to guess. 4 days, every noise had been a coin toss between salvation and annihilation. Whittlesey raised his hand for silence. They listened. The rumble deepened. Not thunder. Not tanks. The ground trembled under their boots. Then screams. German voices. A flare cut through the mist, lighting up the trees with a hellish red glow. The men saw movement, dozens of silhouettes rushing through the fog, weapons ready. Hold the line. Whittlesey's voice cracked through the chaos, and the forest erupted. Bullets tore through the undergrowth. Branches splintered, men fell, and the night swallowed their cries. The Germans came in waves, shouting orders, their bayonets glinting. The Lost Battalion, exhausted, starving, delirious, fought with a kind of desperate rage. They fired until their rifles jammed, then swung the barrels like clubs. One soldier, Private Rosen, screamed as a bullet tore through his shoulder, yet he refused to drop his weapon. Another, a farm boy from Ohio, crawled through the mud to drag a wounded friend back behind a log, even as mortar fire exploded around them. The attack broke like a storm, then faded. Silence returned, heavier than before. The enemy retreated, leaving behind smoke, broken bodies, and the eerie echo of men breathing through pain. When it was over, only a handful of soldiers were left standing. The rest were gone. some motionless, others moaning softly, asking for water that didn't exist. Whittlesey slumped beside a fallen tree. His hands were trembling. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, blood-stained notebook. Inside were names, his men's names. He added 2 more, hesitated, then closed it. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept or eaten something that wasn't moldy or raw. Somewhere in his chest, a quiet panic stirred, the kind of panic that doesn't scream, but whispers, "You won't make it out." Then, above the canopy, the faint hum of wings. The men looked up. A speck appeared in the gray sky. A pigeon. One of theirs. Cher Amy, the bird they had almost given up on. She circled once, twice, and then dropped down toward Whittlesey's arm. The men stared as if witnessing a miracle. He tied a desperate message to her leg. "We are along the road, parallel 276.4. Our artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it!" He let her go. For a moment, she hesitated, then shot upward through the rain. German fire cracked through the forest. One bullet struck her. She fell, twisted, then rose again, one wing hanging limp. The men watched in disbelief as she vanished into the mist. Whittlesey lowered his arm. "Fly," he whispered. "Please! Just fly!" Hours passed. Nothing. They waited, prayed, listened for anything. A signal, a sound, a voice. Then, far away, the shelling stopped. The air grew eerily quiet. Could it be? No one spoke, afraid to hope. And then the faint sound of distant bugles, American bugles, calling from the west. Relief units were coming, but hope was a fragile thing. Before rescue could reach them, the Germans launched one final offensive. Grenades rained down, and screams tore through the trees. The Lost Battalion scrambled to defend themselves, though most barely had the strength to lift their rifles. Whittlesey staggered to his feet, shouting orders through the smoke, but even his voice was fading. The world had become a blur of fire and shadow. When the attack ended, the survivors lay in silence. The forest a graveyard, rain washed the blood into the earth. In the distance, engines roared, American trucks. Relief had arrived. A young medic was the first to stumble into the clearing. What he saw was something he would never forget. Out of nearly 550 men, fewer than 200 could still stand. The rest, dead, missing, or too wounded, too moved. The rescuers wept as they carried the survivors out. Whittlesey walked among them, silent, his uniform stiff with mud and blood. He refused to leave until every one of his men was accounted for. As they reached the rear line, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. The story of the Lost Battalion spread like wildfire. Heroes, they called them. The men who refused to surrender. But Whittlesey didn't feel like a hero. When a journalist asked him how he had done it, he simply said, "We were soldiers. We did what we had to do." Then he turned away, disappearing into the crowd. Weeks later, medals arrived. Ceremonies were held. The names of the survivors echoed across parade grounds, the nation holding its breath in reverence. Yet behind every applause was the ghost of the forest, the cries, the smell, the faces that never left. Whittlesey returned to civilian life, but he carried the Argonne with him in the tremor of his hands, in the sleepless nights, in the silence that followed him like a shadow. He attended banquets, gave speeches, stood in front of cameras, but his eyes always drifted somewhere else, back to that broken hill, where rain fell over the dead and a pigeon had carried their final hope. One evening, on a ship heading toward Havana, Whittlesey stood alone at the deck rail. The sea stretched endlessly in all directions, dark and calm. He pulled a letter from his coat, a note addressed to no one. The wind caught the edge of the paper, and for a moment it fluttered like a wing. He let it go. Somewhere behind him, the ocean swallowed the sound of a splash. They found his empty cabin the next morning. His Medal of Honor was folded neatly on the bed. The newspapers would call it tragedy. His men would call it loyalty, a man who could never leave the battlefield, even when the war was long over. Years later, historians would argue about what the Lost Battalion truly represented: courage, futility, sacrifice. But those who survived never argued. They simply remembered. They remembered the rain, the hunger, the silence. And they remembered their commander, the man who refused to surrender, even when hope had bled dry. As time passed, the story faded into the pages of history, yet somewhere, deep in the woods of the Argonne, old trees still grew over rusted helmets and forgotten graves. On quiet nights, the wind through the branches sounded almost like whispers, as if the men were still there, still holding the line. But history, as always, has its way of stirring the past. Decades later, a letter would surface a soldier's last words, written in trembling ink. It spoke not of victory, but of something far more human. It ended with just 3 words. Tell them why! And suddenly, everything that had happened, every bullet, every prayer, every death and miracle, seemed to lead to that question. Why? Why did they fight? Why did they stay when escape was impossible? Why did hope matter at all in a place where men were consumed by mud and fire? The answers were buried with them, yet their silence still speaks, even now, across a century of distance. Because sometimes, the cost of survival isn't measured in lives lost, but in the ones who live to remember. And as the story of the Lost Battalion faded into the mist of memory, one truth remained unshaken, that history itself had been shaped not by generals or kings, but by starving men in a forgotten forest who refused to give up when the world had already written their ending. Yet somewhere in those ashes of remembrance, something else waited to be discovered, something long buried that might finally explain what the war had taken, and what it had truly left behind. For decades, the forest kept its silence. The mud swallowed the bones. The trees grew tall over rusted rifles and crumbling helmets. But time has a strange way of remembering, of pulling the past back to the surface when the world has almost forgotten. It began with a discovery. A French forestry crew, clearing a section of the old Argonne in the 1950s, found something unexpected. A small, rusted tin, buried beneath a rotted plank. Inside were pages, still legible under the mold and dust. The handwriting was hurried, jagged. A soldier's journal. And on the final page, a sentence written in shaky script. We are still here, even if no one finds us. The find made headlines across Europe, and soon after, American historians arrived. They walked the same ground, now peaceful and green, where the Lost Battalion had been surrounded so many years before. Beneath the soft hum of the forest, they uncovered relics, buttons, belt buckles, dog tags. But one discovery would change everything. A small silver case, engraved with initials almost worn away. Inside it was a folded letter, sealed in wax, never sent. It was addressed to Whittlesey. The handwriting was steady, neat, a soldier's tone, formal yet sincere. It began, "Sir, if you find this, it means I did not make it back. But I want you to know, we followed you because you never stopped believing we could survive. Even when none of us did." The historians read in silence. The forest around them felt different now, not peaceful, but alive, as if every shadow still carried the echo of those who had once stood there. That letter reignited something. Journalists revisited the story. Descendants of the men began to gather. A ceremony was planned at the site. Simple, respectful, not for the cameras, but for remembrance. On the morning of the memorial, fog blanketed the woods just like it had in 1918. Among those who came was a frail man in his 80s, Thomas Riley, one of the last known survivors. His hands trembled as he walked along the ridge, guided by a young soldier who wasn't born when the war had ended. Riley stopped beside a moss-covered boulder, the same one that had once served as their lookout post. He touched the stone gently, almost like greeting an old friend. "I can still hear them," he whispered. "Whittlesey Rosen, the boys from Company F. Every night, I hear them calling the roll." He smiled faintly. "They never left this place." "Not really." A reporter standing nearby asked quietly, "What kept you going then?" "When there was no food, no hope, no way out." Riley looked up, eyes glinting with something distant and fierce. "It wasn't bravery," he said. "It was each other." We stayed because someone had to. Because if even one of us made it out, the world would know we'd been here. He paused, his voice softening. We just didn't want to be forgotten. As the ceremony began, the crowd fell silent. A bugler stepped forward and played taps. The haunting notes drifted through the trees, echoing off the hills, carried by the wind like a message across time. And for a brief moment, it felt as though the forest was listening. Then, from the nearby museum tents, a curator emerged with something cradled in her hands, the preserved body of Cher-Mai, the pigeon that had saved them. Mounted gently in glass, her tiny form was fragile, one leg missing, one eye gone. But she stood proud, wings slightly open, forever frozen in her final act of defiance. The crowd stared in reverent silence. Riley reached out a trembling hand toward the case. That bird, he said softly. She was the last hope we had. I still remember when she took off. I thought she'd never make it, but she did. His eyes filled with tears. She did what none of us could. She escaped. The young soldier beside him asked, Do you think Whittlesey knew what that meant when she flew away? Riley smiled faintly. He knew everything was lost. But when she rose, bleeding and broken, he saw something the rest of us didn't. He saw that even in hell, something pure could still survive. The ceremony ended with the lowering of a wreath. The names of the fallen read, one by one. As the crowd dispersed, the old man lingered. He looked toward the horizon where the fog was lifting and whispered something almost inaudible. You made it, Charlie. You brought us home. But even as peace settled over the clearing, the world outside seemed restless. Across the Atlantic, the letter found in the forest was being studied more closely, and historians noticed something strange. The handwriting didn't match any known soldier from the Lost Battalion. The ink used wasn't common among American units, but it was used by German officers. Beneath the letters, wax seal was a faint emblem, the crest of a Bavarian regiment. The revelation sent shockwaves through the historical community. Why would a German officer write to and how did his letter end up buried beside American remains? Theories surfaced that it was a message of respect, perhaps written by an enemy who witnessed their Others whispered it was something deeper. A confession. A moment of humanity between foes. One fragment of the letter stood out. We saw your signal fires through the night. We fired upon you because duty demanded it. But I want you to know, we admired your courage. We were not so different. You and I, that single line reframed everything. The Lost Battalion was no longer just a story of American heroism. It was a mirror of shared suffering, of enemies who bled the same color into the same mud. It became clear that, beneath the chaos of war, there were still flickers of understanding, that even in the worst of humanity, empathy could still survive. In a dim archive room in Washington, an archivist stared at the letter under glass and whispered, He wasn't their enemy. He was a witness. And maybe that was the truth all along. The Lost Battalion didn't just survive, they were seen. By friend and foe alike. As this new revelation spread, a documentary crew retraced the battalion's path. They had cameras weaving through the same ravines where men once fought. When the footage aired years later, one particular shot struck everyone who saw it, a drone passing over the Argonne Forest at dawn. The mist parting to reveal sunlight piercing through the trees. The narrator's voice, stock calm and reflective, spoke the words found in that final soldier's note. Tell them why. In that moment, viewers across the world finally understood. The story wasn't about war. It was about memory. About the fragile thread between survival and meaning. About men who refused to vanish into silence. The Lost Battalion had not just shaped American history, they had reshaped what it meant to be human in the face of annihilation. Their endurance had inspired policies on rescue coordination, communication, and the psychological study of courage under isolation. They had shown that leadership was not shouting from safety, but standing shoulder to shoulder with those who might never see home again. As the credits rolled on that documentary, the screen faded to black, then reappeared with a single, haunting image. The forest, empty now. The camera drifting over the very spot where Whittlesey's men once stood. The sound of distant rain, a whisper of wind through the leaves. And then, faintly, a single bird call. It was as if Cher-Mai still flew somewhere above, carrying the same message she once delivered through bullets and blood. We are alive. We are remembered! And for a heartbeat, history didn't feel like the past at all. It felt present, alive, breathing, intertwined with every soldier who had ever looked toward the horizon and wondered if anyone would remember their name. Because in the end, that's what the Lost Battalion truly gave the world. Not victory, not medals, not even a story of survival. They gave it memory. Proof that courage isn't measured by how long you fight, but by what you refuse to let die. As the final light fades over the Argonne, the forest seems to whisper again, not in grief, but in peace. The war is long over. The lost are no longer lost. And the echoes of their endurance continue to shape the quiet spaces between heartbeats, where remembrance lives forever. Yet beneath that calm, there still lingers one last mystery, one unanswered question left by those who refuse to surrender. A question that history has yet to fully answer. What if the real battle was never between nations, but between memory and oblivion? And in that eternal struggle, perhaps the Lost Battalion never truly fell silent at all. The forest was quiet again. A stillness so complete it almost felt sacred. The same ground that had once thundered with shells and screams now breathed softly beneath the weight of centuries. Moss crept over forgotten trenches, roots wove through rusted helmets, and rainwater gathered gently where soldiers once fell. Nature, indifferent yet merciful, had reclaimed what men had tried to destroy. It was as if the earth itself had chosen to heal, though it could never forget. In the heart of the Argonne, a young boy wandered the trails one spring afternoon. His school trip had ended hours earlier, but something had drawn him back, a sense of quiet curiosity, a whisper in the wind that felt almost like a calling. He moved through the trees with a kind of reverence, his sneakers sinking into soft ground, sunlight flickering through the leaves like shards of memory. Eventually, he found it a small stone monument, weathered and unremarkable, tucked behind a cluster of wildflowers. The inscription was faint, nearly erased by time. He knelt down, tracing the words with his fingers, to the men who held their ground. The Lost Battalion! He didn't know their names. He didn't know their story. But as he stood there, the forest around him seemed to shift, air thickening, shadows deepening. For a moment, he felt something vast and human ripple through him. It wasn't fear. It was understanding! A faint echo of the lives that had once burned so fiercely here. He reached into his backpack, pulled out his phone, and took a photo one that would later go viral with the caption, "Found this in the woods." Who were they? Within hours, thousands of people answered. Historians, descendants, strangers who remembered the story passed down through family or film. Each reply added another fragment to the mosaic of remembrance. Someone shared the image of Cher Ami, the pigeon who had flown through fire. Another posted Whittlesey's photo of the man who led his soldiers into history and never returned. Someone else uploaded a scan of that long-lost letter, the one that ended with "Tell them why." The post became something more than a question. It became a connection, an invisible thread binding the living to the dead, past to present, silence to memory. And in that moment, it was as if the Lost Battalion had been found again, not in the mud or metals, but in the hearts of those who chose to remember. The internet, that endless storm of noise, had briefly gone quiet for them. Thousands of strangers reading, reflecting, feeling, each comment, a small act of remembrance somewhere in a museum across the ocean. A curator prepared an exhibit. Behind a glass case sat Whittlesey's pocket notebook, its pages brittle and stained. Nearby rested the silver case that once held the letter, the one that blurred the line between enemy and friend. Visitors passed by quietly, listening to the faint soundscape of forest birds and distant rain playing softly in the background. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but the silence that hung there felt like respect. A veteran in his 80s stood before the display for a long time. His own war had been different, in another century, another land. Yet, as he looked at the objects, the mud-caked boots, the dented helmets, the faded photograph of exhausted faces, he felt the same ache stir in his chest. He whispered under his breath, "You made it, boys. You made it home." Then he saluted, not for show, but because some gestures carry meaning beyond words. Outside, rain began to fall again, streaking down the museum windows like tears. Through the glass, the sky over New York turned silver, and the city lights flickered against the wet pavement. Life went on, cars passed. Laughter echoed. The world kept moving but for a moment. The rhythm of everything seemed to slow, as if time itself were pausing to remember. Across the ocean, in France, the boy who had found the monument returned to the forest. His teacher had told him the full story, now how those men had been cut off, surrounded how they'd held out when no one thought they could. He walked to the same spot and placed a single feather he'd found on the path atop the stone. He didn't know it, but the feather was from a pigeon. It shimmered faintly in the sunlight, catching the wind and spinning upward before settling again. The forest exhaled. The world felt quiet and whole. In that moment, the story of the Lost Battalion stopped being about soldiers or battles. It became something greater, something about endurance, about the human refusal to vanish, even when everything is lost. The story had begun in mud and chaos, but it ended in remembrance and peace. Whittlesea's question why no longer felt like a riddle. Maybe there was no single answer. Maybe it wasn't about glory or victory at all. Maybe it was about the simple truth that people can choose to stand for each other even when the world collapses around them. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That memory, passed down and retold, is how the dead keep speaking through the living. The boy stood still, listening to the faint hum of wind through branches. He imagined them. They're the tired faces, the trembling hands, the eyes that had seen both horror and hope. And though he couldn't hear their voices, he felt them. The same way, history breathes beneath the surface of every ordinary moment, waiting for someone to notice. As the sun dipped low, light spilled through the trees like liquid gold, touching every leaf and stone. It illuminated the monument, the feather, the boy's face. And in that quiet brilliance, it was clear the Lost Battalion had never really been lost. They had always been here, in the soil, in the stories, in the choices people make when no one is watching. Because to remember is to resurrect. As evening fell, the boy turned to leave. But just before he did, a bird soared across the clearing, cutting through the last rays of sunlight. It circled once above the trees, its wings catching the glow, then disappeared into the sky. The boy watched it go, smiling softly. He didn't know why, but he whispered, "Fly safe." Back in New York, the museum lights dimmed for the night. The exhibit stood in silence, except for the faint ticking of an old wall clock. In the darkness, the notebook, the metal, and the letters seemed almost to shimmer, as if the memories within them were alive, quietly burning beneath the surface. And somewhere between the echo of history and the pulse of the present, the story of the Lost Battalion continued not as a tragedy, but as a testament, a reminder that even in the darkest forests of life, light can still break through the trees. So perhaps the real message they left behind wasn't about war at all. Perhaps it was about what comes after the resilience of memory, the gentleness of peace, the quiet courage of those who carry the stories forward. Because in the end, history isn't written in monuments or medals. It's written in the way we remember. The way we choose to look back and see not just soldiers, but human beings. So frail, brave, lost, found. The rain eased. The forest grew still. The last light of day faded into twilight, and the world seemed to breathe again. And somewhere, on a quiet wind moving through the trees, a voice seemed to whisper not of battle, but of peace. Not of death, but of remembrance. We are still here. Even if no one finds us! The screen fades to black. A heartbeat of silence. Then the faint sound of wings cutting through air. A reminder, eternal and weightless, that memory, once awakened, never truly dies. And long after the story ends, the question still lingers soft. Human, infinite. If courage can be forgotten, what else might the world lose to silence? Or perhaps, the better question is this: who will remember next?